Today is going to be the day that we begin our adventure into the history of jazz. Today we're not going to look too in depth in the history itself, but talk about sort of some of the foundations of jazz and what makes jazz a very, very unique art form, especially compared to all the other different types of music that are out there. So first of all, something really special about jazz is the fact that jazz is not only America's music, it's world music. I'll talk about what I mean by that. First and foremost, jazz was born in the United States. It is a quintessentially United States musical form. Jazz was born out of the black experience in America, basically combining African and European musical traditions. A lot of the roots of jazz come from a lot of African drumming using polyrhythms. Those are rhythms that use multiple different types of rhythms on top of each other. And taking other art forms from different cultures that they come around with. There are a lot of Afro-Cuban roots in jazz because people went from Africa to Cuba or Brazil, Afro-Brazilian roots, and they came to United States as well. So there's lots of combining of European and non-European musical traditions along with those African-American ones. Jazz evolved from slave songs, spirituals, which are religious black American folk songs, blues, brass band music, and ragtime. So obviously, as a slave, you had a pretty depressing life in that you were owned by another human being and you had no rights. You had very little to show for it. So in work, you could think that it would be monotonous and tedious, and they would sing songs to get through the day. So that's one of the origins of jazz. A lot of these work songs also made their way into their religion. You know, we think about spirituals, and we'll definitely have a listen to some spirituals later on. But spirituals were basically taking the traditions that they were using in the fields for music and applying them to their religion. In fact, a lot of the music had crossover because a lot of the stuff they were singing in the fields was meant to take their mind off of that work, reminding themselves that God would take care of them. Ragtime was an art form related to the march where they ragged a march. And what rag was to take something and to move it off the beat and to draw it out. So they really took strict marches, and instead of being 1, 2, 1, 2, you know, 1 and dun 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 dun. So the march would be very clear about where those feet would go, and the ragtime would put it in the offbeats to confuse you. Then, of course, there's brass band music. So this was a lot of music that was coming over from especially England and Germany, but they had this tradition of playing music with trumpets and trombones and tubas and things like that, and all those sort of things mixed together to create jazz. Jazz is only a little over a century old. That's right, a little over 100 years old. Jazz first appeared in New Orleans in the 1900s. New Orleans was a very important city for jazz because it was a place where people from different backgrounds could come together and nobody really cared about whether you were French or you were African or you were this or you were that. that these cultures could come together and create this new type of art form. Also, New Orleans was a Catholic city in the United States when almost everywhere else was Protestant. So that also set it apart in a lot of ways. African Americans devised the major elements of jazz in its formative years and were the primary pioneers of stylistic changes in later decades. You'll see that today, and even back in the 1900s, predominantly the musicians who played jazz were African American. Of course, there's tons of examples of people who aren't African American who are famous jazz performers, like our local artist of Diana Krall. You also have people like Maynard Ferguson, who's Canadian as well. But predominantly, even today, the major players in jazz are African American, although there are non-African Americans as well. Today, jazz is performed and listened to by people of all cultures all over the world. Many of you will be aware of people like Lucky Chops and Leo P., as well as tons of other groups around the world. Today, jazz is not only considered America's music, it is the world's music, bringing the people of all cultures, colors, nationalities, ethnicities, religions, genders, and ages together. So, another important thing to know is that jazz represents life. So in everything from regular conversation to playing sports like basketball to everyday life, people are constantly improvising. That is, deciding what to do and doing it on the spur of the moment. Improvisation is the defining element of jazz. So just think about that. So when you're having a conversation with somebody, you don't think ahead of time what you're going to say exactly. You don't sit there practicing this conversation that you're going to have because you don't know what's going to happen. When you're out in the basketball court, of course you can practice your jump shot or dribbling or this and that, but you don't know when you move to the right what the person you're playing against is going to do. So you have to improvise what's going to happen. You may have set plays, but you have to react to what the other players give you and improvise. Jazz is partly planned, but mostly spontaneous. Kind of like we were just describing sports. That is, as the musicians perform a predetermined tune or song, they create their own interpretations within the tune's framework in response to what the other musicians are playing and whatever else may be occurring in the moment. So, for example, a soloist is making this improvised solo. That's all new. So that's one place that the spontaneity is coming in. But the soloist creates an idea with an interesting rhythm. Ba-do-da-ba, or something like that. And the drummer hears ba-do-ba, and they feel that there's this ba coming on the end, so the drummer wants to play along. Da-do-da-da. So they're reacting to what's going on, and really, it's all happening in the moment. There's no better example of democracy than a jazz ensemble. Okay? Individual freedom, but with the responsibility to the group. In other words, when playing jazz, individual musicians have the freedom to play whatever they like on their instruments, as long as they maintain their responsibility to the other musicians. They do this by 1. Adhering to the overall framework and structure of the tune. 2, reacting to and supporting their fellow band members. And 3, enhancing the overall sound of the group at large. Jazz represents deeply held values, teamwork, unity with ethnic diversity, the correlation of hard work and goal accomplishment, democracy, and the vital importance of really listening to one another. So, what is improvisation? Well, improvisation is inventing and reacting to something on the spur of the moment in the response to a particular situation. For example, I'm going to improvise a line with no words, just sounds. To show you an example of improvisation. Doot ba da ba bee da. I'd never sung that line before. I hadn't predetermined what I was going to sing. I just made it up on the spot to fit the particular situation that I'm in. A good example of improvisation in everyday life is regular conversation. In other words, every time you talk to your friends, you are actually improvising. Exactly what you're going to say is not planned ahead of time. It depends on what your friend says, then what you say, then what your friend says, and so on and so on. Jazz musicians do the same thing with their instruments, but rather than using words to communicate their thoughts and feelings, they use music to communicate their thoughts and feelings. Jazz improvisation is just a musical conversation. In jazz, improvisation occurs as musicians perform differently every time they play the same song. A song is never played the exact same way twice. The musicians are spontaneously composing as they play. Whenever a song is played multiple times by the same musicians or by an entirely different group, improvisation becomes its own musical dialogue among band members without a preconceived notion of what the final outcome will be. This is one of the things that makes jazz so exciting. That is, you never know how it's going to turn out because the musicians themselves don't know how it's going to turn out. This is in stark contrast to popular music today. If you have ever been to a music concert done by a popular musician or a rock musician, when you come to the middle of the song and there's that instrumental solo, it's almost identical to the one they put down on their album. You know that solo. That's not improvisation. Now, if you went to a jazz concert and you listened to that same group play on an album, and even if you went to another concert, every time that instrumental solo happens in the middle, it would be a different conversation. The musicians and the audience are on this path of discovery together. As we've mentioned, jazz is a conversation, so therefore jazz is a language. Language is what we use to communicate thoughts and ideas. Languages such as English or Spanish or Chinese or Japanese are used to communicate just about everything in life. However, they cannot express emotion in the same way that music can. Emotions like happiness, sadness, anger, and everything in between. As a singular phenomenon, music can communicate emotion to every human being on the planet, regardless of the words they speak, their culture, or even their nationality. That's why music is found in every culture. That's why music is a multi-billion-dollar industry. That's why so many would agree that they are emotionally affected far more by music than even the most beautifully expressed words in poetry. With jazz, because of its improvisational aspect, the musicians are communicating the emotion of the moment. That is, the emotion they are feeling while they're performing. Remember, when improvising, they're deciding what notes to play as they respond to the music of the moment played by the other musicians. In this way, jazz is different from classical music, which is written down or composed ahead of time and played the way the composer wrote it. In jazz, most of the music heard during a solo is spontaneously composed by the musicians themselves and played the way the musicians feel at that given moment. The spontaneity heard or felt in jazz requires the listener to be alert at all times to the ever-changing aspects of a given interpretation of a tune. A helpful analogy. Classical music is to jazz as reading a good book aloud is to having a good conversation. I'll say that again. Classical music is to jazz as reading a good book aloud is to having a good conversation. While a printed book never changes, a conversation changes according to the situation or moment and depending on with whom you're having the conversation. The same jazz tune or song is never performed the same way twice. While it might start and end the same, the middle part is played differently every time. So, what is the way versus what? Jazz is more about the way a song is played rather than what song is played. Jazz musicians can create new interpretations and moods to any song. For instance, an up-tempo or fast song can be played as a ballad and vice versa. The musicians can change the accompanying chords. They can change the groove, so that could be from playing a swing tune to giving it a Latin feel. They can take a short solo or a long solo or no solo at all, and so much more. Jazz musicians have their own unique way of playing their instruments. Rather than just the basic sound of the instrument itself, jazz musicians strive to develop their own unique sound or tone on their instruments. A sound that expresses them personally, just like singers do with their voices. Some like to say that a jazz musician's sound on his or her instrument is simply an extension of his or her own voice. Good jazz musicians have the ability to produce a wide variety of sounds on their instrument, depicting a wide variety of emotions and feelings. Again, just like singers do with their voices. A good comparison. Just like all human voices sound different from each other, but you can still tell it's a human voice, all jazz saxophonists sound different from each other, but you can still tell that it's a saxophone. In order to be able to hear the difference, you've got to listen a lot. The more you listen to a particular jazz musician, the more you're able to recognize that player by his or her sound alone. Again, it's just like the human voice. Think about how easy it is to recognize the voice of your family members and closest friends compared to people you don't hear that much. Also notice how no two singers sound exactly alike, yet they're both using the same instrument, their vocal cords. Jazz fans often prefer one jazz artist over another because of his or her own unique sound. That is, their particular tone on the instrument. Jazz is hard to play good, but good players make it look easy. Learning to play an instrument is challenging enough, so you can imagine how difficult it is to learn to play an instrument and learn how to improvise. But, like anything else, the earlier you start learning how to improvise and the longer you do it, the easier it gets and the better you become. Just like reading or playing a sport. For professional jazz musicians, playing their instruments is as natural as skating is to a professional hockey player. Hockey players aren't thinking about skating while they're playing. They're thinking about and simply reacting to what's going on around them. They're improvising. Jazz musicians aren't thinking about their instrument while they're playing. They're thinking about and simply reacting to what's going on around them. They're improvising. Anyone who can play a musical instrument can learn how to improvise, just like anyone who can talk can learn to converse, and anyone who can dribble and shoot a basketball can learn to play the game of basketball. Jazz is a complex form of music, so it often doesn't have instant appeal, like other more familiar styles of music, such as pop, rock, R&B, and hip-hop. A jazz tune sometimes takes many listenings to begin to enjoy it. But that's okay. The more you put into something generally, the more you get out of it. The more you put into listening and understanding what jazz is all about, the more enjoyment you're going to get. Now, please enjoy this video clip of Herbie Hancock performing Rocket live at the Grammy Awards. You've probably heard this song before and didn't realize that it came from an amazingly prolific and capable jazz musician.